The following message was given at Calvary Christian Fellowship in Colton, California. Calvary Christian Fellowship is a Calvary Chapel affiliated church meeting at the Lawrence Hutton Center, 660 Colton Avenue. If you live in the area and do not have a church home, we'd welcome you to ours. For more information about and Bible study resources from CCF, please visit us on Facebook or at our website, ccfcolton.com. We pray that you will grow in the grace and knowledge of Jesus Christ, and that you will be blessed as you study God's Word with us.
1 Samuel 17, verse 34, But David said to Saul, Your servant used to keep his father's sheep, and when a lion or a bear came and took a lamb out of the flock, I went out after it and struck it, and delivered the lamb from its mouth. And when it arose against me, I caught it by its beard, and struck and killed it. Your servant has killed both lion and bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, seeing he has defied the armies of the living God. Moreover, David said, The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear, he will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. And Saul said to David, Go, and the Lord be with you. So Saul clothed David with his armor, and he put a bronze helmet on his head. He also clothed him with a coat of mail. David fastened his his sword to his armor and tried to walk, for he had not tested them. And David said to Saul, I cannot walk with these, for I have not tested them. So David took them off. Then he took his staff in his hand, and he chose for himself 5 smooth stones from the brook, put them in the shepherd's bag in a pouch which he had, and his sling was in his hand, and he drew near to the Philistine. Israel's monarch-elect has been splitting time between the palace and the pen, doing double duty as a musician to a tormented king and a faithful shepherd to his dad's sheep. The hands-on eyewitness internship paid for by the king has been invaluable, but how will he be propelled into the public eye and seen as more than a musician and more than a shepherd? God has been planning just such an event. And David is going to stumble into it without knowing what awaits him. As with all of us, God has been preparing him for the moments that are ahead. As with all of us, David will have to navigate through several traps along the way if he will have any taste of the victory that God intends for him, and yes, for ourselves. Let's take a look at verse 1. I believe this will become clear. Verse 1, Now the Philistines gathered their armies together to battle, and were gathered at Soko, which belongs to Judah. They encamped between Soko and Azekah and Ephes-dammim. And Saul and the men of Israel were gathered together, and they encamped in the valley of Elah, and drew up in battle array against the Philistines. The Philistines stood on a mountain on one side, and Israel stood on a mountain on the other side, with a valley between them. Philistines have again sought to enlarge their borders with an incursive move into the territory that belonged to the Israelite tribe of Judah. The name of biblical places often describes their topography. Soko means bushy. Azekah means dug in. And these were located in Ephes-dammim, named for its proximity to a battle location. And I love the name Ephes-dammim, what it means. In Hebrew, it means the edge of blood. It's a very manly name. It's approximately 16 miles from Jerusalem, so it's very close into the center of where God's people are. Naturally, Saul's army took up their defensive positions near the valley of Elah, and the two sides remained on opposing slopes. Now, the valley of Elah is a large area, a large valley, surrounded what you and we would call them hills. In Israel, they're mountains. But here, they would be just hills. Between these two hilly slopes lies a seasonably dried riverbed. The comparable-sized armies stationed themselves and began to strategize their respective campaigns. And that's when the Philistines unveiled their game changer. Take a look at verse 4. And a champion went out from the camp of Philistines named Goliath from Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. He had a bronze helmet on his head. He was armed with a coat of mail, and the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of bronze. And he had bronze armor on his legs. and his bronze javelin between his shoulders. Now the staff of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and his iron spearhead weighed 600 shekels. And a shield bearer went before him. Now as the two armies faced each other, the Philistines, with a slight smirk on their face, sent out a champion. Literally, the word means one who stands in the void from their midst. Now, he's not a Philistine, by the way. This guy is a refugee of another people group who made the city of Gath their home. He descends from a group called the Anakim. And guess where they lived before? Do you know where they lived before? They dwelt in Canaan. When the people of Israel came in to settle, Joshua drove them out, but the Philistines welcomed them in, according to Joshua 11:22. This Anakim's name is Goliath or Goliath. The name means splendor, and he was an exceptional champion who, according to most conservative Bible commentators, stood around 9 feet 6 inches tall. Now, I've been at an NBA game before, and I remember A.C. Green, 6'9", walking up to sit near us. I also remember a time when Donnie Osmond stood across from me, and he's exactly 5'0". He's a hobbit. But anyway, 6'9", huge, tall man, 6'9". Then Yao Ming, I saw him in the crowd once, 7'6". That's a pretty big guy. Now, nobody in the NBA is 8 feet tall. And the rim itself is in that 10-foot range. This guy to slam dunk would just need to turn around and, do that kind of a number. He was probably the size of any 2 NBA players on top of each other and the girth of Shaquille O'Neal. He was a very large man. Some people even believe he was as big as 11 feet. And I say, does it really matter? I mean, once you get past 9 feet, isn't it sort of just you are bigger than everybody? You're pretty much the biggest, the strongest, the most intimidating guy in the room. And that was without his armor on. That's him just walking around. But then, you see, he's clothed with all of Philistia's latest metallurgical technology. Bronze helmet, coat of mail weighing in excess of 120 pounds by itself. His legs are covered with bronze. He held a large weapon on his shoulders. Whatever he couldn't carry, and it seems that there wasn't much that fit into that category, his armor bearer would come along and take care of for him. Goliath is an impressive sight without weakness. Now it's interesting, the use of bronze scripturally, as we've traveled through the Bible, seems to indicate judgment. The bronze footings to the tabernacle, the bronze altar in the tabernacle, the bronze serpent in the desert are all part of judgment motifs. Here is a character that has emerged from the Philistine camp, clothed exclusively in it. He isn't simply a sight to behold, though. He's not just somebody who's going to stand up there and kind of growl like some sort of just dumb giant. He also has a lot to say. Take a look at verse 8. Then he stood and cried out to the armies of Israel and said to them, "Why have you come out to line up for battle? Am I not a Philistine? And you, the servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourselves and let him come down to me. If he is able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servants and serve us." And the Philistine said, "I defy the armies of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together." When Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. Goliath's challenge made a lot of sense. 2 comparable armies stationed with equal advantage equals a stalemate. Why spill so much blood? Hey, we're here to fight, aren't we? We're not here to dance. Let's stop slow dancing. That's what Ross Perot used to say. Send out your best man, and I'll stand here, I'll fight him. The loser's side serves the winner. Hey, it's a great option. And not. It's a great option because the majority of the army is spared from needless bloodshed. But terrible in the fact that Israel had no one that can compete with this man. This fight is fixed. King Saul, he's the tallest among the men. He's head and shoulders above anybody else, but he and all of his men are paralyzed with fear. The Hebrew word indicates that they were shattered internally, meaning that their inner constitution was unable to rouse itself to the occasion. This is an interesting word. When you and I get into difficult straits or when we're scared of something, there's something inside of us that is able finally to convince ourselves that we need to go forward, that we can't just stay down any longer. We have to make a move. You see this in movies all the time. The guy is pinned down, but he can't stay there forever. So he has to figure out a way to move. So he convinces himself. That's what they did not have. Every time they came to that point of convincing themselves, we need to go out and fight this guy. We can do it. It just crumbled within them when they saw him. They couldn't rise to the occasion and were continually terrified. And it was contagious. It's the thing about fear. Fear is contagious. It only takes one guy. It only takes one person to infect an entire regiment. In fact, did you know there's times in the Bible God says, hey, listen, if somebody tells you, if you go out to battle and a guy says, I'm afraid, you send that guy home. Because God knows that that person would infect the entire group and that fear would paralyze the whole. Do you remember when Gideon was going against the Midianites? God says, hey, make an announcement. Let them know. Whoever's afraid can go. And Gideon was like, oh, I'm afraid. Not you, Gideon. Everyone else but you. You have to stay. You're the leader. But fear paralyzes. And it's rampant in the camp. Everyone saw the king crumble, and they crumbled right alongside of him. The man that was supposed to lead them as a champ was relegated to being a mere chump. Now, let's switch scenes. Verse 12. Now, listen to the flute playing in the background, tripping through the daisies. Now, David was the son of the Ephrathite of Bethlehem, Judah, whose name was Jesse, who had 8 sons. And the man was old, advanced in years in the days of Saul. The 3 oldest sons of Jesse had gone to follow Saul to the battle. The names of his 3 sons who went to the battle were Eliab, the firstborn, next to him Abinadab, the third Shammah. David was the youngest, and the 3 oldest followed Saul. But David occasionally went and returned from Saul to feed his father's sheep at Bethlehem. And the Philistine drew near and presented himself 40 days, morning and evening. So David was on duty most of the time when Saul was afflicted by the tormenting spirit from God. We saw that last week. When that was abated for a time, David went back to his old job working for his dad, feeding his sheep. David was home when the 2 armies had gathered together at Elah. Jesse's concern for the 3 eldest sons will cause David to rush out to the front lines. The 3 oldest had put their confidence in Saul, refusing seemingly to acknowledge Samuel's anointing as their kid brother, or over their kid brother, as legitimate. David didn't care about this. David's not worried about what they think. He's still out doing what he wanted to do, where he wanted to be. He's doing that with the sheep. He was enjoying his job, loving his time with the Lord, probably writing a few psalms. What a contrast to what we see in the Valley of Elah. David is just enjoying life, just doing what he's supposed to be doing, while the rest of the people are out there freaking out at what they're seeing. Saul and the people, it tells us here, had been paralyzed with fear for 40 days, a month and 10 days, morning and evening. Goliath would come out relentlessly taunting and jabbing at the people of Israel. You think on that first day, probably somebody stood up in the midst and said, yeah, we can take him. Let's go do something. And then they saw him again. It's like maybe it's the light this time. I realized I was a little premature in that discussion. Someone else the second day. You kind of rouse yourself up a little bit. Well, after a few days, you realize no one's going to get up and do anything about this. We're all just going to sit here and cower together. When nobody did anything after that many days, while David is not around, the psychological advantage became a complete advantage as fear sunk deep into Israel's psyche. Now look at what happens, verse 17. Then Jesse said to his son David, take now for your brothers an ephah of this dried grain and these 10 loaves, and run to your brothers at the camp, and carry these 10 cheeses to the captain of their 1,000 and see how your brothers fare and bring back news of them. Now Saul and they and all the men of Israel were in the valley of Elah fighting with the Philistines. So David rose early in the morning, left the sheep with the keeper, and took the things, and went as Jesse commanded him. And he came to the camp as the army was going out to the fight and shouting for the battle. For Israel and the Philistines had drawn up in battle array, army against army. And David left his supplies in the hand of the supply keeper, ran to the army, came and greeted his brothers. Then, as he talked with them, there was the champion, the Philistine of Gath, Goliath by name, coming up from the armies of the Philistines as he spoke according to these same words. So David heard them, and all the men of Israel, when he saw the man, fled from him and were dreadfully afraid. So the men of Israel said, "Have you seen this man who has come up? Surely he has come to defy Israel. And it shall be that the man who kills him, the king will enrich with great riches, will give him his daughter, and give his father's house exemption from taxes in Israel." Now I want you to understand something here that I hadn't really noticed before, or at least it hadn't come into my mind. Jesse's motive in sending David. David would never have been there. David would not have been there during this time. His motive in sending David wasn't with regard to Goliath or the battle. David was merely an errand boy to bring food to the sons and to return quickly with a status report for the dad. David did what was commanded. He is just following his father's orders. He leaves the sheep with the keeper, and the only reason he's there is because his father commanded him to be so. I want you to keep that in your mind. When David arrived there was the usual jostling. Now, when it says that they were fighting, the concept is that they were pretty much trying to get each other off of their station. You know, you've seen this before, right? Where you go out just far enough and you taunt in the other side, but you only go so far because you know that if they come down, you've got this much time to retreat. So the armies are doing this kind of over and over again, sort of, come on, you guys, come off of there. And in the middle of Israel doing this, every now and then Goliath would just pop out and go, boo, and scare them all away. That's what was happening here. I want you to understand that 40 days have gone by. 40 in the Bible is the number of testing. 40 years in the wilderness. 40 days of being up on the mountain. 40 days Jesus was tempted in the wilderness after his baptism. 40, all of them a part of testing. Will this person, will these people, will they trust the Lord? But David comes, and this is the first time he hears it. Understand, he is coming in fresh. He has no idea what he's about to face. He does not know who Goliath is. He may not even know what battle looks like. But what he sees is this big giant of a man who's been staring down Israel for a month and 10 days. And here is his 79th or 80th invitation to battle that will be turned down. David saw the man, he heard the words, and then he saw the effect that it had on all of Israel, who were in fearful awe. The men reported to David, telling him of the dire straits that Israel was in. It had gotten so bad that the king had offered monetary compensation, his daughter, and tax exemption. And it didn't all happen at one time. I imagine it happened in stages. So the first thing was, here are soldiers that they are already government employees. They are already paid to fight. And he says, I will give you more money if you go out there and fight him. A few days go by, no one takes up the offer. Money is not enough to fight him. You're going to have to sweeten that offer. So the next thing is, I will give you my daughter. I kind of wonder, did he not like his daughter? I don't know that I would give many of my daughters. Some days I would give them to somebody else, but not for marriage. Could you go live over there, and I'm sure they would do the same for me. But in any event, there is the daughter that's thrown out there, and maybe a week goes by, and someone's maybe thinking about it. Like, well, she is pretty and everything like that, but no, I can't do it. and then tax exemption. Now, a lot of us are going, that's pretty sweet right there. That's really sweet. Nobody he cannot sweeten the deal any more than that. He has nothing else to offer. And these guys are just standing there. Not one single man in all of Israel's army stood up for duty in 40 days. And there was nothing you could do to get them to go. Not one man came forward. Not one man believed in God's capacity to act on their behalf. This is a sad statement, isn't it? When you really think about it. An entire army of men gathered and under the banner of God, and not one will stand. That is tremendous. Fear had crippled the entire army. Goliath defeated them by simple fear and intimidation. He didn't even have to raise his sword. He didn't even have to use his armor. All he had to do was speak fear, and they complied. He had beaten them with his voice, not his fists. Israel, they had believed in Goliath. In Goliath, they trusted. They believed his power to destroy them without ever testing that belief. They just knew they were defeated. You kind of wonder who could have stood in. Who could have stood in that gap? Could it not have been anybody? Could it not have been one person? Some nameless Joe. No offense. Could it not have been some nameless guy in the horde that would finally say, I'm going to do it? But not one. A sad statement. There wasn't a reward big enough to change their collective minds and propel them into the valley. Look at verse 26. Then David spoke to the men who stood by him, saying, what shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away this reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? And the people answered him in this manner, saying, so shall it be done for the man who kills him. Now Eliab, his oldest brother, heard when he spoke to the men, and Eliab's anger was aroused against Goliath? No, David. And he said, why did you come down here? And with whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know your pride and the insolence of your heart, for you have come down to see the battle. And David said, what have I done now? Is there not a cause? And he turned from him toward another and said the same thing. And these people answered him as the first one did. The only shocking thing here is that David is the only one with rage. He's the only one that's mad about what's happening. Who's going to do something about this? He's a heathen dog insulting our God. David is having a fit. And the people are giving him the details, but his brother's about to give him some grief. Eliab heard what David said and immediately lashes out against him. Wouldn't you? This is the first time he's seeing and hearing Goliath. 39 days ago, and the mood might have been slightly more optimistic than it was now in the camp. But now here comes this young pup, barely over 20, asking out loud why this man is allowed to blaspheme the armies of Israel. Shouldn't something be done? Eliab is constrained by being the older brother of this loud-mouthed boy. He's also convicted that his cowardice has been as vocal as David's challenge. Listen to the way he talks to him. What are you doing here? You don't belong here with the men. You belong with those little sheep. That's about all you're good for. Eliab's diminutive stab at David was ironic. He accuses him of pride and presumptive arrogance when it's his gargantuan ego that has been assailed. He's accusing him of saying things to show off in front of the men and to show up his brothers. Now, David can't win with Eliab. Did you notice what he does? Do you notice? He just responds to him quickly, and then he goes and he asks other men. He's not deterred. He doesn't have time for Eliab's unfair assessment. He needs to know who's going to take care of the real problem, that giant out there. David makes sure that he focuses on the real enemy. Could you imagine if David decided that it was worthwhile to argue with his brother? Here, his brother has raised this concern. What a foolish thing it would be for him to start amassing some kind of case and saying, well, look at this, and let's talk about this case here, and have you noticed this in my life? And hey, by the way, do you remember Samuel? Do you remember that day, huh? Do you remember how he poured oil on me? You know what? I still have that cologne. I can bust it out if I need to, Eliab. What a waste of time when there is a giant in the valley. How often are Christians guilty of focusing on secondary issues when the primary issue stands unaddressed? How many days will we as a church, not we, I mean, we're perfect, but those other churches out there, there's other ones, the ones that have problems, not this one, no. Now, how many days will the church fight over debatable minutia, while the people that God intends to save are terrorized by an unrelenting, spiritually terrorizing enemy? I was sitting in the park one day. It was Saturday in the park. I was sitting in the park with our kids, and somebody came up to me, and I was reading my Bible, because, and I don't know if you ladies know this or not, but when guys are told to watch the kids, what that means is we can play on our phones or read the Bible while they're doing dangerous stuff in the monkey bars. That's watching the kids. You mean keep their eye on them. I mean they're within yelling distance, and if you hear crying, you're supposed to look up. There's a big difference. But anyway, so I'm reading my Bible, and I'm there at a park in Loma Linda. This guy comes up to me with a Bible, and of course, it's a small Bible, and every verse that has something to do with the Sabbath is underlined and highlighted. There's whole other portions of the Bible that are left alone, but Sabbath is underlined, pointed to, in highlighter. And we're sitting next to this guy who just happens to be sitting there. And this guy begins to talk to me about how I need to keep the Sabbath. And we're going back and forth. And this guy is over here, and he's doing the thumb race, and he's texting somebody. And I finally looked over at him, and I said, I am so sorry. You have to listen to this as I destroy this man. I said this out loud to him. He has no biblical case for what it means to be saved. I'm sorry that we haven't talked to you about Jesus. He says, oh, that's okay. I've seen enough. And now, boy, I didn't blame him. I don't want to be around that. Here we are talking about all these issues when there's a person sitting there who needs Jesus. I love David's curt response. And you can feel free to be curt with people. I think it's biblical. Look at what he says. Don't I have a cause here? Hey, don't we have something bigger literally bigger. Like as big as you can cut them. Look at that guy. Don't we have something bigger to deal with here? This reminds me of Nehemiah's words. I don't know if you remember or have read through the book of Nehemiah. We'll eventually study that probably in 17, 18 years. But it reminds me of Nehemiah's words to Sanballat and Tobiah, who sought to meet with him in the plain of Ono. Nehemiah 6:3 says, I am doing a great work so that I cannot come down. Why should the work cease while I leave it and go down to you? David said, oh no, to the conference at Ono, home of Yoko. Now, for more men, for more people like David and Nehemiah. David bypassed Eliab and kept asking around. Nobody was saying anything different. He couldn't find one brave man among them. Look at verse 31. Now, when the words which David spoke were heard, they reported them to Saul, and he sent for him. Then David said to Saul, let no man's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go out and fight with this Philistine. David's courage, which should have been standard. Every guy in Israel, they have a history of having a God who routs the enemy without them ever raising a hand. You would think one guy would have stood up and said, I want to be in the story. I want to get my name in that book. Not one of them. So the standard courage that should have been seen everywhere, it was so out of character that it caught the king's attention. I want to meet this guy. Someone comes in to Saul and says, hey, believe it or not, there's a kid out here who thinks something should be done about Goliath. Send him in. This was the best news that Saul had received for over a month. And David's confidence seems a little off-putting at first. I love this. Have no fear, David is here. Now, in order for you to visualize this, how many of you know who Richard Keel is? You know? Richard Keel, he played Jaws in the Bond movies. 7 foot tall, mouth of brass. He's actually 7'2". He died a few years ago. Pretty imposing, gigantic figure. Add 2 more feet and you've got Goliath. Okay. On the other side, you just think Opie. Okay. Richie Cunningham. So Saul has been looking at Richard Keel. In walks Richie Cunningham. Don't worry about it. I got him. Oh, what a nightmare. But look, David has gone from saying, someone should do something about this, to, don't worry, I'm going to do something about this. What a huge difference. Listen, this is my favorite line of the sermon. Anyone can say, someone should be doing this. In fact, everyone had been saying that for 40 days. When that is the case, no one is doing anything. Oh, do you like that? You should come up and look at how it's typed on my... I love this. David didn't just suggest a course of action or present a few viable options. He put himself on the line and said, I'll do it. Let no man's heart fail him. I'll represent our side. In our church, I've said it before. I will say it till I die. If you have a vision, you have a mission. Now, some of you are going, I have a vision, but I'm not going to say it because then I'm going to have to do it. And I say to you, you don't answer to me for the vision God gave you. You answer to the Lord. So you better be responsible because you're not going to face me on Judgment Day. You will face my wrath if you come to me and say, I have this vision. This is what you should do. Oh, you'll see an ugly side of me. And not this one. I get ugly when I'm mad. You probably think I'm furious. I love David's heart. He's not waiting for anybody else. He's not going to go train someone. He's not going to go over and go, hey, let me prop you up. I think you should go out and fight David. You look like the kind of guy that could handle a David like you could go fight Goliath. Look at you. You're buff. You're studly. You're young. You got nothing to lose. Let's get you going. That's not David's way. That's not the man of God's way. The man of God's way is to say, I've got this. I'm going to trust the Lord. I'm going to go and do this. That's God. That's a godly man. Verse 33, and Saul said to David, you are not able to go against the Philistine or fight with him, for you are a youth, and he a man of war from his youth. Boy. Now Saul had been encouraged. He heard this news. He's all excited. Finally, a man is going to come and do this thing. And in walks little Davy. Now consider the source. Here's a man who's been given over to an evil spirit, who spent 40 days in complete terror, staring at a seemingly unbeatable foe. All of his men, have spent the same time revealing their cowardice. Saul effectually places his unbelief on David. Hey, nobody else can do this. You can't do it. Saul can only believe in the most fearful expectation. He sees no other possibility. And sadly, there are many in the body of Christ who are just like this. They're the naysayers. They're the ones at the sight of any kind of spiritual activity who are going to stand up and point out all the reasons why this thing can't work. You ever been so ready? You've been like the Lord's been showing you through His Word as you've been reading, and you've been built up and you're excited about what He wants you to do. And you go and talk to somebody and they're like, well, brother, let's pray about praying about that. Oh, you can't do that. You're too. Oh, you're too. When you're too old, you're too old. And when you're too young, you're too young. It's like when you talk to parents about, oh man, I really loved kids at that age. And it's never the age that their kids are at that time. But they're naysayers. And here comes Saul. Because the only thing Saul knows is he can't do it. So how can anyone else do it? I mean, this kid, there's an obvious lack of experience. This guy that you're looking to fight, he's been a champion since he was your age. And he's at least twice your age now. How do you think you're going to face him? Saul has no conception of the spiritual giant that David already was in comparison to himself. Listen to what David says. Verse 34, but David said to Saul, Your servant," notice this line, "your servant used to keep his father's sheep. And when a lion or a bear came out and took a lamb out of the flock, I went out after it and struck it and delivered the lamb from its mouth. And when it arose against me, I caught it by its beard and struck and killed it. Your servant has both killed lion and bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, seeing he has defied the armies of the living God. Moreover," David said, "the Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear, he will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine." And Saul said to David, "Go, and the Lord be with you." Does David let Saul tell him what he can or cannot do in the Lord? Oh, there's a lot of people who do, though. There's a lot of people who go to their Saul, their respected elder, somebody in their life that they're going to submit unto to some degree. And I'm not saying that there isn't a good place for proper submission, for proper praying about those kind of things. I'm not saying that. But David knew something had to be done. David knew he was the man for it. And he didn't let Saul's naysaying deter his determination. As many people of faith have had to do, he seeks to comfort and convince his elder. David's job as a shepherd, you and I, we see shepherds on occasion out in the road in an industrialized area. It's fairly safe. But here, it was a significant, dangerous job. And you were either protecting your sheep, your commodity, that which you had been stewarded with, because you would have to pay for whatever sheep had been damaged or would have died or whatever, or had been taken. You would have to protect them from highwaymen who were looking for an easy meal, or dangerous beasts who were roaming through freely around the countryside. In those days, Israel was filled with forests. Not so much today. Back in 48, when Israel came back into the nation, they replanted several forests, and they've really recovered quite a bit, but not like it was in David's day. So altercations with wildlife were common. David makes an interesting statement here. I told you to notice it. Did you see that? I used to keep sheep. Verse 20 of this chapter is David's farewell to the sheep. He has a new life that's in front of him. So he speaks of his shepherding in past tense. God is moving David forward. He senses it. David's about to be thrust into the spotlight. God's about to make him a shepherd of men in much the same way as Jesus made his disciples fishers of men. That employment is over. I think David senses it. He knows that his courage has been tested. He's rescued his father's lambs from the mouth of lions and bears. What? No tigers? What a wuss. Anyway, the defenseless sheep had a champion. Now Israel would have one as well. But his point here, this isn't his first giant. A lot of people believe that they could go. Now here's the counterpoint to what we were saying earlier. Somebody who walks into this thing called Christianity, they decide, I'm going to go fight a giant. But they've never fought anything. May not be ready. But David, he's already fought giants. And in fact, I'm willing to say that it happened somewhat recently. Maybe in that 40-day period. I wonder if this wasn't something that had happened in those last few weeks. I wonder if maybe as he was keeping sheep, all of a sudden there were these two attacks and he's kind of going, boy, that's kind of odd. That doesn't happen very often. That's sort of strange. I haven't had to fight a bear or a lion before. And I wonder if he did it. And sometimes you know how like when you're having an issue with your car and it's fallen on somebody and you need to pick it up and you show supernatural strength and you're able to pick it up. I've never seen that or done that. I'd throw my back out big time. But you see that on television and it's happened, but it hasn't happened to me. It won't ever happen to me, so don't get caught under a car. But the point is that here David, all he sees is there goes a sheep in the mouth of a lion. And he just runs after the lion. Me, I'm going, hey, enjoy your meal. You sort of deserved it. You caught me off guard. I wasn't watching. David, though, he's, not on my watch. And he runs out after him. And he steals the sheep back out of his mouth and slaps the little kitty. And then afterward, he realizes, what was I thinking? Why would I do that? That seems very strange behavior for somebody to do that. It's just a sheep. I should have just paid for it. But then the bear came, and I wonder if when the bear came, he worked off that lion episode, and he realized, I remember what I did last time. And this time I got a different strategy. This time I'm gonna grab him by the beard. I'm gonna look that bear in the eye. I'm gonna give him one. I'm gonna knock him into next week. Point is when it comes time to face Goliath, he'd already faced a lion and a bear. God prepares his people for everything he calls them to do. Now, I would suggest to you that you might look at some of the trials in your life. Go see if there's some common situations that you see over and over again. Just by example. I know it's not happening here, but just for example, you're really stressed out about finances. God comes, I know. Finances, it's called money, and it's green, and every now and then it gets into your wallet and immediately goes out of your wallet. Some of you might know what that is. I don't. But in any event, you're stressed out about bills. How are we going to do it? How is it going to happen? And God does it. He's preparing you to trust Him. Next time it goes a little longer. You hold your breath a little longer. You're trained a little longer. You're stronger a little longer. Before you know it, you may lose a job. But you've already seen Him provide. You know that your job is only a measure of His provision. And soon you trust the provision and not the job. Big difference. Oh, there's a lot of other stories like that. But I would encourage you to look back and go, how has God been how has He been training me? What are the lions and bears that have been going on? There might be a Goliath coming soon. I would just look and watch. But this isn't David's first giant, and it won't be his victory. Look at what he says. David's confidence, it was not in his ability to move faster than a lion or a bear. That would be stupid. It's his confidence in God's ability to deliver him. And Saul's convinced. I love this. Saul's not a spiritual man. But here he goes, hey, the Lord be with you. Now look what Saul does. Verse 38. So Saul clothed David with his armor, and he put a bronze helmet on his head. He also clothed him with a coat of mail. David fastened his sword to his armor and tried to walk, for he had not tested them. And David said to Saul, I can't not walk with these, for I've not tested them. So David took them off. Then he took his staff in his hand. He chose for himself 5 smooth stones from the brook and put them in a shepherd's bag in a pouch which he had, and his sling was in his hand. And he drew near to the Philistine. Saul was happy to consign David to the Lord so long as he covered him in his armor. I love this. Saul didn't want to use his armor himself, but his armor was going to be out there. He's not going to let David go without it. Saul's armor was made for him. Remember, full grown, head and shoulders above everybody else. How was David supposed to wear this? I wonder if Saul was going to allow him to be clothed in his armor, and so that when the Philistine killed him, everyone would go, oh, it's Saul's armor. It must have been Saul. Yes, it was me. I was out here the whole time. That's the kind of guy Saul was. Remember, he likes to take credit for stuff. If it wasn't for my resource, Saul says, if it wasn't for my wisdom, it wasn't what I can put on you, you're not going to win. But if David had believed that, he would have failed. Saul didn't even ask, did you notice that? He just starts putting stuff on him. The Lord be with you. Wait right there. Boom, boom, boom. And before you know it, David's like trying to, he looks like the robot, you know. he's trying to, and he can't move. And it didn't take, I wonder if it was just a simple respect thing. And David's just going, okay, well, I guess he's putting this on me now, and it's just being forced upon him. And he just admits, he goes, listen, I can't wear this. I haven't tested these things. I haven't employed this strategy before. And this is a great point that I feel we cannot miss. You and I cannot wear another person's armor. We can't wear what's designed for someone else. We can't be something that someone else is. So important. David was the one who was called. David's experience as David is what's necessary for this battle with Goliath. Not David's copying of someone else's experience and putting someone else's armor on to fight. You can't go out as somebody else. You can't go with someone's gifting or imitating someone else's gifting. You must go with what God has given you. Sometimes we think, boy, I really need this armor. I need this thing to really propel me into service. And then we realize as we look back, well, wait a minute, I didn't wear any armor when I fought the bear. I didn't wear any armor when I fought the lion. Maybe I don't need it now. We get so caught up sometimes, don't we? When the stakes get higher and the people that we're going to fight are more brutal. Oh, I can't go and minister unless I have a seminary education. Really? I can't witness to that guy. Look at me. I'm this way, they're that way. If I were like him, I'll argue like him. I'll think like him. God's going, no, he doesn't listen to him. You're not off-putting. He's not already offended by you. You go talk to him. I know what I'm doing. Sometimes I look around, and whenever I walk around, I realize, I don't know if you guys know this about me or not. I am Hispanic. But I've realized that I'm not much of a Hispanic. Maybe you've noticed that. I don't know. And sometimes I'll walk over here to the park, and there'll be some guys that seem like they're a little bit rough around the edges. And I go walking up, and I'm all clean cut, and my testimony is I turned in videos unrewound years ago to Blockbuster. I tore off mattress cover to, there ain't much. Sometimes I'm a little intimidated because I don't have that life. I haven't murdered anybody. I haven't been in prison. The one time I was in prison, it was to minister to people who were in prison. I don't have much of a story. Sometimes I wish I had a story so I could put it on and I can go and they would listen to me. You can't live your life that way. God has made you who you are with the story you have to impact people that you don't know. And if you try to use someone else's story, it's ridiculous. And they look at you funny. They realize that's not who you are. Don't try to wear anyone else's armor. You can't walk around with that stuff. I love what David did. I love that moment. And you should write it down. You should point to it, underline it, argue with a brother about it at the park in Loma Linda. He took that off. He decided, I'm not gonna wear this. I don't need to wear this. I know what I'm going to go with. My walking stick, 5 stones from the riverbed, and my sling. He goes over and he collects these stones. Some of you are going, what's he going to do with 5 stones? Is it like a rapid fire slingshot? No, there was 5 giants. Goliath and his 4 brothers. He wants to be sure he's got enough ammo for each one. But do you notice that? He didn't bring like 10 or 15. He brought 5. He knew that's all he needed. He didn't have any problem. I think David is a shepherd. You know what guys are. You see a pomegranate? And if you're sitting down, you're under the shade tree or something like that, you're not going to go up and get it when you can get your sling and start practicing to get that thing down, right? You guys know what I'm talking about? He's practiced a lot with this sling. He knows he's not going to miss. And for goodness sake, this guy's head is the size of Las Vegas. You're going to be able to hit that thing without any problem. So without any armor, with all that he just has what he has and has always had, the Bible tells us he did the one thing that no one else ever did. He drew near to the Philistine. What's he clothed in? Does he have any defenses? Does he have anything other than his stick and what he's always had as a shepherd boy? He goes in with what God has given him, with the confidence that only can come from the Lord, right into God's appointment. Now we're going to stop there today. I don't want to spoil it for you. Maybe you'll read ahead and figure out what happened, but I'm not going to tell you. I will tell you that it's a little anticlimactic because David's already won before he even raised a fist. If you're going to serve the Lord, you'll want to avoid the traps that David did. And let me flesh them out for you here as we close. First of all, David moved past the personal disdain and the character assassination of his brother Eliab and remained focused on the real enemy. You will never have victory unless you identify the real enemy. He might have decided to fight a secondary battle and never engaged in the war, but he moved past personal disdain. Second, he navigated through professional experience necessary by keeping his own experience with the Lord in the front of his mind. He might have been given into the suggestion of Saul and been immobilized by intimidation. But he remembered, this is what God has brought me through. I can see the pattern. So he navigated through professional experience necessary. Finally, he resisted the temptation to present himself in another man's armor by realizing that he had never needed these implements before. He might have worn Saul's armor and only shared Saul's fate. Let us remain focused on the real war, mindful of the sufficiency of the Lord's personal preparation and gifting for the task at hand. This is how you experience victory without raising a fist. Let's pray.